Okay, numbers are still going up. We might see a few more people trickling in, but I think we'll probably make a start if that's all right with you, Jill. So I'll just do a little bit of housekeeping stuff and then I'll hand over to you in a minute.
Okay, that's great.
So welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. This is the second webinar that we're doing this year, and there's a few more coming up as well. So if you're interested in joining any of the future webinars, keep an eye on our Facebook page or follow us on Eventbrite, and that's where you can find the details. If anyone is unfamiliar with Zoom at this point through the COVID crisis, just in case, you should see a few options if you hover over your Zoom window. At the bottom of the screen on mine, it may come up somewhere different on yours. I've got a chat function with a little speech bubble next to it, and I've got a Q&A function with 2 speech bubbles. I think all your cameras and microphones should be off automatically, so you don't need to worry about that. But if you do have any questions as we're going through, please can you put them in the Q&A. So if you click on that Q&A with the 2 speech bubbles, it should pop up somewhere on your screen so that you can type into it. If questions stay in there, that helps me to keep track of them as we're going through. But if you just want to chat to each other, or if you've got any maybe any technical difficulties or anything like that, you can send me or everyone or whoever you want a message on the chat. I'm sorry that my camera is off. I'm having technical difficulties tonight, but hopefully that's the only technical difficulty we will have. So I think that is all you need to know for now. So Jill, I'm going to hand over to you. So I should say that before I hand over, sorry, Jill is the manager of the Tree Nursery at Dundreggan. A lot of hard work is on there that Jill will explain all about.
Okay, right, thanks Kat. Okay, so I'm just gonna put my camera off for a while I go through the presentation. There we go. Okay, so this is all about the work of the Tree Nursery, and the nursery is located at Dundreggan Estate, which is in Glenmoriston, to the north of Loch Ness, and you can see there that we've got trees in outdoor beds in the ground. We've got 6 polytunnels with a hard standing for the containerized trees, and then the nursery has space inside in the office and a seed preparation as well in the building there. The nursery moved to this site in 2012 and then gradually built up to the size it is now. There was a small nursery before 2012. It was at a smaller site near Glenafric, and even before that, some of our Aspen propagation work began over at the Finton Foundation, where Trees for Life's head office is located, in the 1990s. We grow a full range of species native to the Caledonian forest, but really specialise in some of the harder to grow species, such as aspen and species suitable for high elevations. So some of these are not readily available from more commercial nurseries. So although we supply some trees competitively, the nursery is not really run as a commercial nursery, and certainly until the pandemic hit, it relied heavily on the work of volunteers. Oh, so I put this photo in just because all the rest of our photos are very spring and summer-like, but the nursery has looked more like this for the last 2 months during January and February. So for the first part of the presentation now, we're going to look at how the nursery works generally and the processes that go on. And then in the second part of the presentation, I want to talk in more detail about some of the specialist projects. So that's the high elevation plants or Montaigne plants, and then the Aspen propagation after that. So all the seeds and cuttings we grow are collected locally mostly by ourselves. So we only grow local provenance trees suitable for the Scottish Highlands. And here we are seed collecting. So top left there, you've got Downy Birch seed collection. Top right, that's Emma collecting alder cones. Bottom left, that's Sarah with holly on a particularly cold day when we went to Glenafrac, and juniper at the bottom right. Just to say, there's quite a lot of record keeping involved in the tree growing, and this starts prior to seed collecting even. We need to apply to the Forestry Commission before the collection goes ahead in order to get a certificate for the seed collection. Each batch then needs to be kept labelled and identifiable all the way through every stage of processing and growing, so that we can issue documents with the trees when they go to be planted. And these supplier documents show the provenance of the trees we have supplied. So here we've got some acorns and hazelnuts. We take these out from their cups or calyx. Both of these species don't store so well, and so they tend to be either sown or stratified straight away. Stratifying just means keeping them cold and moist over winter so that the dormancy is broken and they can germinate in the spring. So most of the trees that we're dealing with, the seeds will have some kind of dormancy, and this prevents germination at an unfavourable time of the year and can spread germination over many weeks or even years, which then increases the chances of successful seedling establishment in the wild. However, on the nursery, we need to overcome the dormancy in an even way so that we can grow large uniform crops of the trees as much as we can. For the hazelnuts, you can see them being weighed in the right-hand photo as we need to record how much we've collected. Then we mix them with a free draining mix of bark and sand and put them outside for the winter, protected from mice and voles. And then we sow the ones that are germinating in spring. If we sow them straight away in autumn, it's harder to protect them from being eaten. Once the mice or voles find a concentrated stash of nuts in cold weather, they will just keep coming back and take the lot, as we found out in the past. So seeds from berries, they nearly always germinate better if the seed is removed from the flesh of the berry, as germination inhibitors can be present in the flesh. It's quite time consuming squashing all the berries to extract the seeds by hand. You can see juniper berries here on the left, and then extracted seeds on the right. Juniper is one of the species we need the most patience for. The berries take 2 years to ripen on the bushes first of all, so when collecting, you can't collect all the berries, only the ripe ones. And then the seeds require a minimum of a cold period followed by a warm period and then another cold period. So that's 2 winters if they are left outside. No seeds will germinate in the first spring after they were collected. Most seeds usually, but not always, germinate in the second spring, and then often more will germinate in the subsequent springs after that. So this means we get several crops of seedlings from one batch of seeds. Every species we're dealing with has slightly different size seeds and different hardness of berries to seed. So it's quite a difficult process to automate on the scale that we're doing it at. But sometimes we experiment with some gadgets to make the squashing of the berries and separating the seeds easier for us. This is 2 of the trainees that we have on the nursery experimenting with a passata maker for mincing up rowan berries. The mixture on the right is the result, and that contains all the seeds which we need to separate out, especially if we want to store the seeds for the future rather than sowing them straight away. We actually find rowan one of the trickiest to separate from the berry, as the seeds are quite small and soft, and the berry is relatively hard. So we used to collect the seed from each species we wanted to sow every year, but recently we've changed to collecting each species only in good seed years for that species. So these will vary dramatically from year to year, the crop on the trees, and it means that when we do collect, it's much more plentiful to collect the seeds, but crucially, the seed has a much higher viability, or it's much better quality. And so we've put quite a lot of effort into learning how to store seeds better and for longer. And several of the nursery staff were really lucky to be able to attend a course at Kew Gardens Millennium Seed Bank, which was really fascinating, as they have learnt vast amounts about the long-term banking of seeds from all over the world. So since then, we've invested in a new fridge and sealed jars to keep our stores of seed that we've dried down, keep them cool and airtight, so aiming for the healthiest seed for sowing that we can manage. But whilst they're stored cool and dry, the dormancy of the seeds will not be broken, so we'll still need to stratify the seeds outside over winter, as I described before, or for some seeds which only require a short period of cold to break their dormancy, such as birch and alder, then we can soak the seeds and keep them in the fridge for their cold period prior to sowing. So we really have two methods of growing trees on the nursery, either in the ground, in the nursery beds, or in containers. Both systems have advantages and disadvantages. Containerized plants are increasingly popular. They allow a longer planting season and help spread out the workload on the nursery too. But watering and management is critical because the trees are in such a small plugs of compost and can easily deteriorate if they're not looked after carefully. The trees in the ground go to be planted bare-rooted without any soil, and so when they are lifted, they need really careful handling and storage of the plants at that stage. But during their growing time in the nursery, the management of the plants is less critical in terms of watering and looking after them. But the workload for the bare root trees does tend to peak in spring and autumn. So the containerized trees first. Most of our trees in containers start off being sown in seed trays like these ones. So here we've got Scots pine seedlings shortly after germination, and they've still got their seed coats on top of the seed leaves there. And then they're pricked out into plug trays. So pricking out just means carefully taking the seedlings out of the seed trays and putting them into the plug trays where they'll grow up to planting size. These particular trays are called root trainers. And yeah, there's a group of volunteers helping us to prick out, and we spend a lot of our time on pricking out during the spring and summer. Here we are again. This is the same process, this time with rowan seedlings going into root trainers once again. So the newly pricked out seedlings are going into the tunnel on the left in the photo, and those on the right have already grown on and they've been in the tunnel for a little while. The root trainers have a large hole at the base of the container, and if we put the container straight down on the ground, the roots would just grow straight through into the ground. So we put them up onto pallets for air pruning. Air pruning is just the fact that most roots will not grow through air. So when they come into contact with the air at the bottom of the container, they're nipped off in the same way as they would be if they were physically pruned. So the other great thing about root trainers is that you can open them up to inspect the roots easily. The grooves in the side guide the roots downwards for root pruning at the hole in the base, and this encourages the roots to bush out. So in the same way as when you nip off a plant at the top and it bushes out, if you nip off the roots at the bottom, they bush out but downwards. And so what we hope to end up with is a plug full of downward pointing roots, and this is the best possible start when it goes to be planted. And it is the opposite of what can happen in round pots, especially if you just have one long taproot and it circles round and round and round, and that can cause real stability problems for the tree later on, and sometimes they never recover from that if it's severe. So the faster growing species of tree, such as downy birch or rowan, they are moved out from the tunnels after just a few weeks inside and will be up to planting size by the end of the first growing season. Slower growing species, such as these juniper seedlings and other conifers as well, will stay in the tunnel for their first year before they get moved outside and take at least 2 growing seasons to be up to planting size. So trees are moved out from the tunnel onto the hard standing on their pallets, where they continue to grow and harden up, ready for planting out. And this is another shot later on in the season with plenty of growth on all the trees there. Okay, so now we go to the nursery beds, where it's more commonly a 2-year process to get the trees up to planting size because they haven't had that boost in the tunnel to begin with. Seeds are scattered in the seed bed, usually in spring, and then the following autumn or the next spring, they are lifted out of the ground and lined out. This just means replanting them in the beds in lines with more space to grow on up to planting size in the second year. So here we've got Scots pine seedlings after germination in their seed bed on the left, and on the right they're in their second year after lining out. This one is oak. Both of these photos are actually in their seed bed, but they make a really pretty photo because they have such beautiful colours on the new leaves when they come out. This one is alder. So here again you've got a seed bed on the left, and on the right that's alder in their second year, growing after lining out. Some of the faster growing species like alder will grade them out after 1 year, so that there is a crop of seedlings for planting out at the end of the first year, and then it's actually the smaller seedlings that are grown on in beds for a second year to get them up to size. Once the trees are ready to be planted, they're dug up between October and April when the trees are fairly dormant. The soil is all shaken off and they're graded for size. The roots will be trimmed if it's necessary, so that they're no longer than a spade's depth, ready for planting. And this is important, so the roots go straight down into the ground when they're planted and are not curled and twisted up, because the trees don't like that. The trees are then fully enclosed in the white tree bags and sealed up. And the photo on the right there, that's one of our biggest ever orders ready to go. So the bare root trees are best planted as soon as possible, but they can be stored in cool conditions for a while if necessary. Trees from plug trays, they're taken out of their trays and also graded for size, and then either wrapped or put into bags, into packs of 16. And they can stay in their packs in trays on the hard standing for quite a while if necessary. Okay, so now want to move on to look at the Montaigne plant propagation. So this is the high elevation plants. The Montaigne plants make up the woody species in the Montaigne scrub habitat. This is one of the rarest habitats in the UK, which now exists only in sort of small isolated fragments. It occurs at the tree line. It's a transitional zone between the forest habitat and the alpine habitat. So it includes some regular forest species which grow up high, such as Scots pine, rowan, downy birch, but it's above the altitude for tall trees. So because of exposure to cold and wind, their growth will be really restricted, and they often take on a gnarled and twisted nature. But then it also includes more specialist species, particularly dwarf birch, dwarf willows, dwarf juniper, which never grow really high. So I've chosen a photo here from Norway, actually, where in the south of Norway, there's very similar habitats and climate to Scotland, but they do have extensive Montaigne scrub habitat, which really is just about missing in Scotland. So it's really difficult to see landscape scale Montaigne habitat. But in this photo, you can see the dwarf willows in the foreground, and then there's woody species going up and up onto the hills, which is the thing we see rarely in Scotland. And so most Montaigne plants grow up above the surrounding vegetation, but this is just to show another extreme. So here we have a dwarf juniper, which is spreading flat over a rock, and so very, very low growing species. Here's the dwarf birch. You can see the leaves in autumn colour on the left, have a really pretty round leaf, and it grows as a bush rather than a tree like other birches. And although it's not common, it's not really scarce either, and we're lucky to have plenty on the estate at Dundreggan. But on the open hill, it's mostly browsed down quite low, with little chance for flowering and seeding. But we have had dwarf birch fenced from herbivore browsing for almost 20 years now, and inside these fences it can grow up to form decent sized bushes. The largest one we've seen is about 1 metre across by 3 metres, but that's extreme. Normally it is much more straggly bushes, but it is able to grow up, and in this situation it flowers and sets seeds. So you can see some female flowers on the left of the slide there, and then they develop into seed catkins, as the ones on the right there, and the catkins stay on the bush throughout the winter. So it's fairly easy to collect at any time, although it will be eaten by grouse through the winter as well. So although we never find seedlings growing in the wild at Dundreggan, the seed does germinate, and we've produced plenty of seedlings on the nursery, some of which we plant out ourselves, but we can also supply these to projects elsewhere. And a few years back, there was a real surge of interest in restoring the Montaigne habitat, but not really a supply of plants for all those projects. So at that point, we looked at what other species were really needed for the Montaigne habitat. And the next obvious group to look at were the dwarf willows. So the willows were much more challenging than the dwarf birch. Well, first of all, because we don't really have hardly any on our own land, not the specialised Montaigne willows at Dundreggan. And many of the species are now pretty rare. And also the different species can be challenging to identify from one another. So there was a big learning curve when we started working with the willows. On the slide, you've got downy willow. That's one of the specialist Montaigne willows. Photo on the right is from the Cairngorms, and the one on the left, that's a willow with female catkins on, and that's out in Glennaquey near Glen Affric, where we've done most of our collecting for Montaigne willows. This one shows woolly willow. That's the rarest Montaigne willow we have. It's the bluey green creeping plant. Both downy and woolly willow have leaves adapted to the cold, exposed locations and have this bluey green appearance, which is very attractive. And woolly willow is can be found in garden centres and in gardens, and really is an attractive garden plant. But in the wild now, it is said to be only found in about 13 sites across Scotland. So this slide is just to give an idea of the terrain where these willows are growing. These are out in Glennaquey. Plants on the right, you can kind of see that they're growing on a vertical cliff. So this is one of the reasons why it's pretty difficult to collect Montaigne willow seed in the wild. Firstly, the access, because they're highly palatable, the willows, so very attractive for deer browsing. And so they're growing mainly in areas out of reach of the deer, and this also makes them difficult for us to access. Secondly, the seed, when it's ripe, is inside this fluff which comes out of the catkin and just blows away. These ones are photographed on the nursery, but it would be really, really difficult to time seed collections at the top of mountains for seed which has to be collected when it's just ripe enough but not blown away. This seed would just blow away instantly at the top of windy mountains. And also browsed bushes in poor condition are unlikely to produce flowers or seeds. In the photo you can see on the right, those downy willows are the bigger bushes, and they're kind of approaching head height on the nursery, and full of leaves, bushy and vigorous. But on the left you can see some out in the wild. They're a bit more accessible than the ones we were looking at on the vertical cliff, and here they're in poor condition, really browsed, and so struggling to produce leaves, let alone flowers or seeds. And quite often, if the populations are in poor condition as well, even if they flower, there might not be a good ratio of male to female plants, and so seed produced might not be viable. So our strategy with the willows is to collect cutting material, as willows will grow, most species of willow will grow readily from cuttings. And here we are out in Glennaquey, collecting from as many different individuals as we can, but it is steep and difficult to reach those plants, even to get cuttings. And for some of the rarer ones, the woolly willows, we brought in contractors to collect by going down on ropes. So you can just see in the centre of the photo on the left, the ropes there, and someone descending down. And then on the right, that's their photo looking back up at the type of terrain that they're working on there. So once we bring the cuttings back to the nursery, they're just hardwood cuttings. We put them in the ground without any leaves on. And on the left there, you can see fresh growth just coming when the plants start to grow. And on the right, there's woolly willow plants growing on in their second year after collection. So then, as the plants get bigger, our aim is to plant them into a seed stand. This is a downy willow seed stand where each plant is labelled individually. So we do have a record of where each plant was collected from. Around 50 plants is thought to be ideal to produce genetically variable and robust seedlings from dioecious plants such as willow, which that means that they have male and female flowers on separate plants. And in some cases, we've had all the plants tested genetically as well, so that we know they're all unique and not just copies of the same clones. So these willows flower in early spring, and a really good source of pollen at that time of year for bees in particular. So in the photos here, you've got male downy willow flowers on the left there. The pollen's going to come out of all those stamens. And on the right, that's female downy willow flowers, I think after they've been receptive. So these ones have already been pollinated, and now they're developing into seed catkins. So as you can imagine, collecting seed from these seed stands that we've planted up is a lot easier than from the tops of inaccessible mountains. So it means that we can get seed collections, and they should be much more genetically variable too, because we've planted for different individuals altogether. So once willow seeds are ripe, they don't store well, so they need sowing immediately, and they start to grow straight away. You can see them growing within 48 hours of sowing them. So here in the photo, we've got downy willow seedlings in root trainers after they've been pricked out from the seed tray stage. And here we've got woolly willow seedlings outside, almost at size ready for planting out. But there's a lot more work we can do as yet, as I think collecting the parent material for seed stands for all the different populations of Montaigne willow species is one of the most important pieces of work we can do to conserve the Montaigne habitat for the future. The willows where we have been working have only recently been properly surveyed, but there's loads of anecdotal evidence that the plants are declining, they're disappearing, their vulnerable state because of deer pressure, as well as being damaged by avalanches in winter on the unstable slopes where they grow. It's pretty difficult to protect them where they are at the moment, but at least if we have these collections of plants in seed stands, we'll be able to produce plants in the future for restoring the montane habitat. So as well as more different species to collect, we also want to be collecting different populations from different geographical regions. So already we have 2 seed stands for the downy willow species, both of which come from different regions. And that's the species we've done the most work with, and we're hoping to set up a 3rd one of those. And then, of course, there are other species to work with as well. And we've only just really begun to get enough material for the woolly willow seed stand. Oh, and this is another different montane species that we've just recently had a go at. This is rock whitebeam seedlings. These are also palatable, only surviving on inaccessible sheer cliffs, and these ones were on cliffs dropping straight into a loch. So these ones, the seeds for these ones were collected by boat. Okay, we're moving on to aspen now. So aspen is the only native poplar species in the Caledonian forest. Has spectacular autumn. You can see there in the picture. Its Latin name is Populus tremula. The leaves tremble in the slightest breeze when other species are all quite still. And you can sometimes hear it before you can see it in the forest because of the noise that the leaves make. It grows in stands, which means all the trees are connected under the ground by a single root system. And this enables the organism to live on beyond the life of each individual tree, because as trees fall, others will grow up from the root system. And these shoot directly from a root system. They're called suckers. So one of the problems with aspen propagation is that aspens flower rarely in Scotland for reasons that are not well understood, but they do respond to hot weather and tend to flower the following year after a hot spell. So there was a good flowering year in 2019, but the one previous to that was in 1996. So they don't flower and set seed every year like most tree species. And even when they do, it's still only a few individual stands that flower profusely in the northwest of Scotland. And because they are dioecious, so that means having male and female flowers on separate trees, you need both male and female stands near enough to each other, both in flower, for pollination to occur. And even if you get those conditions and viable seed is set, it's not easy to collect. If you have a look in the photos, the catkins or flowers are high up at the top of the canopy of trees, in trees that are not very suitable for climbing. And just like we saw with the willow catkins, as soon as the seed is ripe and comes out of the catkin, it blows away. So there's many challenges to collecting aspen seed in the wild. So our main method of propagation has been vegetative, but not from cuttings, because aspen don't root readily from stem cuttings like willows will. So we use the suckers from their roots instead. So this involves collecting root sections from aspen stands early in the year and planting them in boxes in the polytunnel. Here we've got one of our volunteers collecting roots growing near the surface of the ground so we can keep disturbance of the site as minimal as possible. And here the boxes of roots in the polytunnel. The warmth of the polytunnel is encouraging the roots to send up young suckers, which we cut off the main root and place into root trainers into an automatic mist unit, which will stop them wilting whilst they produce roots. You can see them coming up in kind of clusters. So we take the largest of those, and then the others all keep growing, so we can collect many cuttings from each root section during a year. And it's at this stage, when they're cut off from the main root, that they're able to produce their own roots and rapidly grow into new trees. But they're all clones, so they're all identical genetically to the original stand that we collected the roots from. And this is an extremely expensive and labour-intensive way of producing trees. So more recently, we've been involved in a project started by another charity, Coily Alder, to try and get aspen to produce seed in a controlled environment, such as the polytunnel. And in order to grow aspen for this project, we took cuttings from trees that have been known to flower in the wild and grafted them onto young aspen trees. So the photo on the left is a freshly grafted plant where the cutting, which is called a scion, has been placed into a cut in the stem of the young tree and then taped in place. And on the right, a graft is successfully growing a few weeks later. You can just see a change in stem colour where the two plants have joined together. This is the same process as used for all fruit trees. Apples, pears, oranges will all be grafted, and it does help to produce flowering at a younger age and a smaller size. So this is the aspen trees in our polytunnel, which were grafted in 2013 and 2014, and they're managed as a seed stand. So there is a lot of pruning to encourage flowering and keep the trees to a manageable size, as they would quickly be up to the roof otherwise. And then one other thing is needed to get them to flower, and that is stress. So stress promotes flowering, and to apply stress, we take pieces of bark from the tree when the sap is flowing and put it back on, but either twisted or inverted, and tape it back up, seal it, to prevent the damage from killing the tree. And if we're lucky, the part of the tree above that barkwork will then produce flowers the following year. So the most success we've had with this to date is in 2020. And here you can see flower buds forming. Fat, swollen buds are flower buds, as opposed to the slim buds, which are leaf buds. And here we've got flowers coming out in the polytunnel. That's female ones on the left and male flowers on the right. But we don't find that the males and females always flower at the same time. So we tend to collect the pollen from the male flowers, and it stores quite well in the fridge. And then here is Emma hand pollinating the female flowers when they are receptive with a brush. So the pollinating the hand pollinating has worked quite successfully. And here we've got seeds coming out of the female catkins when they're ripe. And if we get good seeds there in the catkin there, it's possible to get several hundred seeds from just one of those catkins. So like the willows, the aspen seeds are produced in spring or early summer. They're a tiny seed, not the sort of seed that store easily, and they need to be sown immediately they are collected. And then they start germinating straight away. Similar to the willows, you can see them growing after 48 hours on the surface of moist compost. And here they are just a little while after germination with their seed leaves showing. And here is Emma with the seedlings growing on in the tunnel after they've been pricked out from the seed trays, each one being genetically unique. So although it is quite a lot of work managing the seed orchard, we really hope this will be worthwhile if we can grow thousands of aspen seedlings each year and even supply seeds to others if it continues to be a success. And then finally, I just wanted to mention that we're also wanting to do some work on the rarer ground flora species in the pinewood. So far we have concentrated this work on twin flower. This is a species where there are maybe only around 20 known patches of twin flower left in the Northern Highlands, and each patch is likely to be a single clone, so one individual, and tends not to produce seed, as cross-pollination with other individuals isn't possible. There are also, a lot of them are left in suboptimal conditions, vulnerable to disturbance and other threats. On the photos you can see the leaves of twin flower on the left growing in the forest, and on the right there's the flowers of the twin flower. But they would be pretty difficult to spot if they weren't in flower because they're growing there amongst blaeberry leaves, so really difficult plant to spot in the forest. This is a patch growing on the nursery, and also is just a patch of one individual. So it's a creeping plant, and long trailing pieces can be cut off, often with roots attached, and either transplanted into the forest directly or grown on in containers to form a new plant. But we've also been experimenting with these small 2-node cuttings in order to produce as many plants as possible from the material we have. So far results have been quite variable, with some good success, but it shows really that some twin flower clones are really much stronger and more robust than other clones. And so the plants that we produce are being used by a project called the North Highland Twin Flower Project, which aims to establish new viable populations at suitable sites where they are safe for the future, as well as having the right conditions for regarding soil and canopy cover and so on, as twin flower tend to be a bit fussy about shade and vegetation and so on. So here are plants we have produced, along with clones from elsewhere in the Highlands, being planted out at a new site with the different clones close enough together that hopefully seeds will be produced in the future. Okay, and so that is the end of my presentation about the nursery.
Thank you, Jill. That was Really fascinating stuff, and we've got quite a lot of questions that have come through as you've been talking. If anyone's got any more questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A, and you can also look through other people's questions and upvote them or comment on them. The ones that are upvoted will go to the top, so that I know that they're the really popular ones, so that's quite handy. So if it's all right with you, Jill, I'll start reading them out to you and we'll see how many we can get through.
Okay.
Okay. So Fiona was wondering if the way that Scots pines are treated in the nursery dictates whether the tree goes twisty or not, or does it just depend on the conditions where the tree is planted after leaving the nursery?
I would say that was much more to do with the conditions where they're planted after leaving the nursery. So we know that the level of exposure that they get according to the altitude that they're planted makes a huge difference to the height and style that the tree grows into. So yeah, I would say definitely the conditions after leaving the nursery.
Great, thank you. Elliot has asked, do deer eat twin flower?
I'm not absolutely certain if deer eat twin flower. It is growing in forests where deer are present, but whether they particularly go for twin flower or not, I'm not quite sure on that one.
Interesting. More research needed, and I guess with more twin flower around, we'll just get more and more data as well. So doubly useful. Yeah. Kuzi has asked. He put a comment on earlier about foresters in Turkey who have managed to find a quicker way of propagating juniper. I think he said 60% quicker. So he's asked, are you planning to collaborate with forest nurseries outside the UK, for example, these ones in Turkey? Would you like to try their method in your nursery?
Well, we certainly would be interested in learning about any new techniques that come on. Yes, so speeding up juniper germination would be great. And yes, we do try to collaborate wherever we can, although we're not currently in touch with anyone in Turkey.
Great. Another question about juniper. Andy has asked if we grow juniper from cuttings as well as from seed. He's just started taking cuttings on mull and asks if you've got any tips.
We did used to grow juniper from cuttings. We didn't find it particularly easy. We used to put them in a shady cold frame and found that it still took quite a long time. And sometimes we got good success, but this, I think, was mainly from plants that were grown, that we grew in good conditions where they were growing quite rapidly. And then the cutting material seemed to do a lot better. When we took cuttings from plants in the wild, which didn't have that strong growth on, then I don't think they were so successful. And in the end, once we got going with the seed production, although it's a long process, it can be 6 years maybe from collecting the seed to planting the plants. Once we'd got that in process and had got seeds going, we just found that that was a lot more straightforward and less time consuming than doing the cuttings. So I think if you haven't got seed, then cuttings is obviously the way to go, but you still need a lot of patience for the cuttings as well.
That's good to know, thank you. Quite a few people would like to know roughly how many trees are planted each year.
What, at Trees for Life, or?
Yeah, so I assume how many trees are grown at the nursery and planted out? And perhaps how many trees do we get from elsewhere as well to plant out? Would be good to know.
Well, currently the nursery can produce in the region of between 70 to 90,000 trees each year. So some of these go to be planted at Dundreggan, some of them go to be planted at other Trees for Life projects, and some of them go elsewhere to entirely different projects. The amount of trees that we plant at Dundreggan is quite variable each year, so it depends on the project on the go. So in some cases we supply all the trees ourselves from the nursery, which is happening just now, but at other times we have brought trees in order to plant larger sites as well. So there isn't a set amount for planting every year, and also equally it will vary with the other Trees for Life projects elsewhere. There's no set amount, it depends on the project on the go at the time.
Thank you. Malcolm has asked, in fact there are a couple of questions about climate change, so I'm going to combine them. Somebody earlier on asked, do we take climate change into account when we're deciding what trees to grow and to plant? And then Malcolm here has asked, have we considered collecting seeds of native trees from further south in anticipation of climate change?
So I would say it's certainly something that we're considering and is obviously a hot topic for consideration. And yes, we certainly should consider perhaps, I think the most common thing we've thought of is, planting at higher altitudes. We haven't considered collecting seeds from further south. At the moment, that isn't within the recommendations. All our seed collecting is very local, and I think at the moment that's what we'll continue with. I think one of the main things we can do, particularly applying to the rarer species such as the willows that I was talking about, is just to make sure that we retain a good selection, a wide variation genetically of the species, that is maintained for the future, so that adaptation to climate change can happen. I think that's one of the most critical things we can do. And I think one of the things that climate change may affect, first of all, is the flowering and the breaking of dormancy of the tree seeds. So that's one of the things to watch out for, first of all, I think.
Thank you for that. Kind of on a similar note, Kate has asked, what are the rules on collecting local tree seeds for raising trees?
Well, the rules that are set out really govern the marketing of tree seeds, and the supply of trees, and also it's the funders that set the criteria for the provenance of the trees. So if you are growing trees for yourself to plant yourself, then it is up to you. There aren't standard rules that apply everywhere, but for example, for best practice, then you would collect local seed as locally as you can, but also taking into account elevation, not just geographical location. So from a similar elevation to where you're wanting to plant, and within the same seed zone. So the country is divided up into seed zones, and you would source your trees from as local a seed zone as you can. And if you had funders that were specifying, they may say that you have to have trees of this seed zone or the next seed zone, and you would need to comply with that. But yeah, there's quite a bit of flexibility in the rules, and especially if trees are not available from the seed zone where you are, then you would need to go to the next one.
On that note, we had a question from David saying, do you limit the number of seeds taken per tree and thus samples from more trees to maximize genetic diversity among the trees you produce?
Yes, that would be best practice as well, certainly to when you're out on a collection, is that you would try and collect the same amount of seed from many different trees, from not from all close together as well, for exactly that reason, so that you are getting a good genetic mix from the population that you're collecting from. So there are always exceptions, and if you're limited for seed, that can be difficult, but certainly those are the guidelines for best practice.
Thanks. A few people would like to know, what's the most important resource that you want to obtain to expand the nursery work? Quite a difficult one, I think.
Well, yeah, I need to think about that one. I'm not quite sure. So we have expanded the nursery up to a size that we feel is manageable with the methods we're using, which are all very manual, and certainly up until pandemic times was working with volunteers. We kind of feel that we reached a level, a size where, you know, to go beyond, you really need to automate processes, and it becomes a very different activity then. So I'm not sure that we're looking to expand the nursery in size at the moment, but yeah, our ambition is to expand the work that we're doing on the specialized species, and so we need funding to enable us to do that. The sale of the trees that we sell and the value of the ones that we plant at Dundreggan does not cover the production of the trees, and so yeah, I'm afraid it comes down to funding to be able to continue doing work on the rare species.
So you mentioned that volunteering was impacted by the pandemic. Keith and a few others have asked, how did you cope without volunteers last year?
Well, first of all, we had a lockdown team of staff that were able and willing to stay at the nursery. So so that was critical, because as you know, that hit at the springtime, which is absolutely crucial for the nursery. So those staff were able to live there and increase all their hours in order to keep the nursery all going through the spring. And yeah, although we couldn't do everything that was planned, certainly the nursery kept going and everything was looked after really well by those staff. And then for the autumn season, we actually had a lot of work to do, some of which was like a backlog from what hadn't been done before. And we were able to get some grant money for an emergency grant money to employ some more nursery workers. So yeah, there was a little, but very little volunteering in the autumn as well. And so all of that work was done by some extra workers.
Everyone did an amazing job throughout last year getting that all done. It's a huge amount of work. Beck and Jane have asked, is there annual soil improvement for the beds, mulch or fertilizer, etc., And are there any common pest and disease issues? Are chemicals required or used?
Yeah, so we make garden compost on the nursery from all the weeds and also a waste from the house and so on. Each time the beds are lifted and emptied and re-prepared, then garden compost will be added. And sometimes we'll use an organic feed when we're seed sowing on the bed. But generally little more than the garden compost is needed. And was that pests and diseases, that question, the other question?
Yeah.
So we try to grow as organically as we can, but we haven't managed that totally. The main pest that we need to deal with is aphids, particularly on those aspen that stay in the tunnel, but also on the young seedlings as well. And we deal with these mainly now with biological controls, which we bring into the tunnels. So a very little spray for insects used, if at all now. But there are some diseases that we need to spray for, which we're finding we've tried, but we find it hard to find any alternative. So rust is one of the big ones that we need to spray for, and unfortunately it's really common on the species that we're specializing in. So willows and birches are particularly affected, and we do spray fungicide for that. Those are the main issues.
Thanks, Jill. So the questions are coming in about as fast as you're answering them, so we'll keep going. How long, there's quite a few technical questions actually. How long do you soak the alder and birch seed? And how long do you keep it in the fridge after soaking before sowing?
Yeah, alder and birches, we soak them for 48 hours and then can store them in the fridge, either surface dried or moist, for 4 to 6 weeks before sowing them. So they're just shallow dormant, those ones. So 4 to 6 weeks is enough before you sow them.
John has asked, do we supply trees to other reforestation projects beyond Trees for Life's programs? And on a similar note, Paul has asked, do the trees just go out to the local area or further afield? So we do supply trees for other projects beyond Trees for Life, but they are still mainly in the local area. But by local, I mean I'm including the Northern Highlands and out to Skye and so on. So tend not to send trees very far south, but we're growing trees, yeah, for the Northwestern Highlands, sometimes Skye, and then we're doing some projects with estates in the Cairngorms area as well. And Julian has asked, looking back at the trees you first planted at Dundreggan, how has that changed the landscape or wildlife?
Yeah, well, there were trees planted on Dundreggan before Trees for Life actually bought it. I think that was 2002. And when you walk in the pines there, it is they're well above head height now. And yes, it's just so different to being on an open hill. It's absolutely amazing to see the wildlife and the birds quite often flying around you, and you can hear the bird song. So there's a real different feeling to being on the open hill. And then some of the ones that were planted more recently, since I've been working at Dundreggan, it's the alder that grow the fastest. and they have produced such a thick trunk size and so amazing and bushy. So yeah, they'll be changing the landscape soon as well.
Thanks for that. We've had a great question from Joe and Cleo, who have asked, if you were a tree, what tree would you be and why?
Well, I don't know. That is similar to the question of what is my favourite tree, and which I don't have an exact answer to. So we have, I think all of us on the nursery like different trees at different stages. And which tree would I be? I'm still not sure, but yeah. So we love the hazelnuts. They're such a nice seed to work with. We obviously love the aspen. I love the oak when they're coming up with all the different colours on. So we like different trees at different stages, but I don't have an overall favourite, I'm afraid.
I think that's a really good answer. It's hard to choose a favourite, and a forest is made of so many different types of tree rather than just one. It's important to have the diversity, isn't it? Important to have lots of different types.
Definitely.
I wonder, Joe and Cleo, what tree you would be. You put that in the chat, maybe. So a question from Andy. He's collecting aspen cuttings for Aspen Project. Many of the stands here are just a few small stems on a cliff. Would you consider any stand too small to take cuttings from, or is it worth getting as much genetic diversity as possible?
I think that we would, well, yeah, I think my opinion is that we would still collect from small stands, because yes, we would want to be propagating as much genetic diversity as we could. I think the main consideration would be not to go back to that stand to collect too regularly, but certainly making a collection to get those to get that clone propagated, I think would be a good idea. And although taking root sections from trees does seem harsh, with the aspen, the roots on both sides of the section that you cut will survive and grow, so very different to cutting roots from other trees, where obviously the root will die once you've cut a piece out of it. So I would be inclined to go ahead, but yeah, limit the amount of material you take according to the size of the stand.
In a similar vein, Mark has asked, is it possible to cut aspen suckers coming up in our lawn and grow these on? And when would be the best time to do this?
Yeah, you certainly can do that. I'm not quite sure the best time. I would say spring, before they're fully in leaf, but maybe March, April time, once they've sort of started to think about growing, but not fully in leaf, and cut them out with a piece of the original root if you can, because that root has quite a bit of energy in it and can help them get started if they need to grow their own roots. So, and I would go for spring, I think.
Okay, question from Joe. This isn't technically on the work of the nursery, but you might know the answer. When you extract the seeds from juniper, can you use the pulp to flavour gin?
I don't know enough about the gin making process to do that, but I don't see why not, but I'm not sure how they use the berries, and whether they take the seed out before they use them when they make the gin. No, I need a bit more research on that one, I'm afraid.
Something to look into. Question from Naomi: how much area in Scotland do you have to plant the trees in?
Well, how much area? So that depends on the project at the time that we're supplying the trees to. So our own land at Dundreggan is 4,000 hectares, although we can't plant on all of that. And at Dundreggan, there's still on the open hill, there's too many deer to plant without fences. So we have projects on the go which are enclosed by fences. So these are big fences that may be enclosed maybe 200 or more hectares at one go, and we would plant them over 2, 3 or more seasons, 2 or 3 or more years. So that's the kind of scale of project that we're working on at Dundreggan, but that's just one project that our trees are going to, and so we hope to work with many other landowners, particularly in Africa, where we might work with Forestry and Land Scotland or the National Trust for Scotland, and other private landowners as well. And every project will be a different size, but generally speaking, they will be discrete projects, probably inside a fence most of the time in the areas that we're working. And so I don't have an overall size to quote, I'm afraid. It just depends on the project that the trees are going to.
Thanks, Jill. I've just noticed the time. We've got quite a few more questions. Are you happy to keep going, or are you needing to get away?
No, that's all right. We can keep going for a bit, yeah.
So the next one is from Morag, who asks, how do you propose to protect the trees on Montaigne habitat in the future?
Yeah, that is a classic question that is very difficult to answer. So, but I think the answer is that we need to reduce the deer numbers in the long term. So just where we are at the moment, it's not possible to restore the Montaigne habitat without the use of fences, but that isn't the long-term solution. And so I think certainly in the Cairngorms, where there are really big estates working together, bringing down the deer numbers, then I know that some of our plants are going to a project where they won't be inside a fence this coming spring. So that will be really interesting to see how they do. And yeah, I think that is the way forward to get the Montaigne habitat established again, is bringing down deer numbers.
A few people have asked, can you recommend any further reading on the topic, maybe popular literature or good references, inspiring stories, any books that explain the processes that go on in British tree nurseries, that sort of thing?
I could have a think about that one.
We could
not
maybe
off the top of my head, so I could look for some references, but most stuff that I'm aware of is actually quite old and out of print. So yeah, I'd have to think about that one a bit more.
Quite often out of print books are online in some form, a PDF or something. So maybe if you could put together a little list, I can email that out to everybody with the YouTube link. That would be great.
Yes, yeah, I can do that. And certainly there are some good Forestry Commission booklets regarding the native tree system and so on. So yes, I can include that as well.
That'd be great. Thanks, Jill. Bernadette has said, the work that you're doing over there is inspirational. Might you think about writing a manual for the public to have nurseries in their gardens?
Well, we can think about that. I think we are managing to record maybe more and more. I mean, this webinar being one of them. We haven't got a manual as such, no, but certainly we are interested in training, and we have a trainee program on the go, and also we offer, when the volunteering is possible, again, we do really offer quite a bit of training work there. So I think more and more of the work might be put down in writing, but at the moment there isn't a manual as yet, no.
Maybe something for the future if you get a chance. Another question from Cleo. She said, there's lots to be proud of, Jill. Are there any special standout projects for you?
Well, just the ones that I've highlighted, really, the Aspen work and the Montaigne Willow work are the two ones that stand out. Yeah, so is that what she means, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I thought you highlighted some particular work that to me are standout projects, like the Twin Flower and the Aspen project, and the rock white beam as well. It's brilliant work.
Yeah, I'm not sure yet about the exact place for rock white beam in the Montaigne habitat. That it seems much more localized in its distribution, and I don't know how we'll take that forward yet, but and much more on coasts and associated with water. So I don't know if that is such a general one that we'll do so much work on, but I really feel that the Montaigne Willow work, that's a key one, which is really important, and we can do so much more on that one. And the Aspen work too is just beginning to be successful. So those are the two really key ones that we're putting a lot of time and work into. A twin flower and other ground floor plants, I think maybe that's a bit more for the future. I mean, we are doing twin flower work now, and we're hoping to get some more clones growing on the nursery. And then material will be taken from those for the North Highland Twin Flower project. So that one is on the go, and we hope to do more of that in the future. So that's something to look at in the future. But the two main ones at the moment are the Aspen and the Montaigne Willows.
Thanks, Jill. Frances has asked, do juniper need protection from deer?
Deer do eat juniper and juniper berries, but not to the extent of other trees. So certainly at Dundreggan, juniper is re-establishing itself quite well on the hillside where the deer are. In fact, it's one of the species doing the best, and it can be used as protection for other trees. So if there are bird cherries or birches or rowan are coming up and they grow in the middle of a juniper bush, the juniper bush will offer some protection. So although they are browsed, and certainly if you plant juniper straight from the nursery, so of course we've used some fertilizer and so on in the nursery, so those ones will be tastier than ones growing in the wild, then the juniper will the deer will certainly have a go at those juniper, but in general they will survive alongside the deer.
That's good to know. Okay, quite a technical question from Andy here. When do you start hardening off cell-grown trees if they are to be grown on for a second season? Do they get hardened off and then brought back in the tunnel, or just left inside all winter? I think Andy might be growing some trees himself.
Oh yes. Can you just say the first part of that question again?
Yeah. When do you start hardening off cell-grown trees? So if they are to be grown on for a second season, do they get hardened off and then brought back in the tunnel, or are they left inside all winter?
Okay, so if they're to be grown on for a second season, so it varies. With the conifers, we've tended to keep them inside over winter, and then they'll go outside later on in the spring in their second season. With some of the willows, which are grown on for a second season, we've started bringing those out sometimes in the autumn, and they'll be outside over winter and then carry on growing outside for the second season. So it does vary a bit. I don't think it's too crucial, and sometimes it will vary according to what space we need in the tunnels as well. But yeah, at the moment our conifer seedlings in their first year are still inside the tunnel, and they'll come outside later in spring and grow up to size for next autumn.
Thanks, Jill. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here on using different things in your soil mix. So Tom has asked, on planting out on the site, we've experimented with mycelial and charcoal mixes. Has this been tried in the nursery as well? And if so, has it shown any noticeable effect on plant growth? And Marie has asked a similar question about biochar. Have we experimented using biochar?
Well, we have experimented using Mycorrhizal Inoculant. This was one that was collected, locally collected from the forest at Dundreggan rather than a bought-in one. And yes, we tried it in the nursery, as well as with planting trees on the hill. There's still a lot to learn about this, I think, because of the reaction between the mycorrhiza and the effect of the fertilizer on the trees. So we tried it using it instead of fertilizer on the nursery, and yeah, I would just say there was mixed results. That's the problem, and we don't have a definite conclusion. So it did produce some nice little sturdy birches, which I think were much better than the tall birches we produce sometimes with fertilizer, but it wasn't an even crop. So an awful lot of the birches were too small and then had to be fertilized. And this is because if the tree is given enough fertilizer, it maybe doesn't want to form the association with the mycorrhiza as it would in a more natural situation. So I think there is a reaction or a conflict there between the two that we need to learn more about. We also tried it on seed beds, the seed beds in the ground, and here again there was mixed results, and we felt that there was some mycorrhizal. We got the roots tested, and there was some mycorrhizal reaction, but not necessarily just in the beds where we'd applied the inoculant, so it was present in other beds as well. And from our own just observations, it looked like the mycorrhizal was present on the roots that were below the zone of the regularly turned soil. And so unfortunately those roots would be, in our normal practice, cut off before they went to be planted. So whether that inoculant would then survive the transplanting So all of this investigation raised far more questions than it answered, I'm afraid. So this is still something we're monitoring and looking at on the hill, and hoping we'll get some results from. But yeah, nothing conclusive to report, I'm afraid.
That's really fascinating. There's a whole world of information to discover there, isn't there? There's so much that we don't know about these relationships. I'm looking forward to the kind of uptick that's been in research and what we might find out in the next few years. Research generally across the board. We're past 9 o'clock now, Jill. How are you doing for time?
Okay, it's okay. We can do a few more. Is there plenty more yet, or?
We've still got another 25. Some of them maybe we can combine, but I imagine some of them we just won't be able to get to, but we'll do our best.
Right, well, let's go for another 10 minutes or so anyway.
Okay, thanks, Jill. So the next one is from Tom, and he asks, for the nursery stock which is sent to external projects, roughly what proportion is supplied to private landowners who are regenerating their land, as opposed to charitable or government projects?
Very little to private projects. I don't have a figure, I'm afraid, to quote, but yeah, the vast majority is going to charitable or government organisations.
Mm-hmm. Keith has asked, have you ever tried to propagate bearberry from cuttings? And if so, do you have any advice?
No, we haven't grown bearberry. It is something we may be interested in, because I don't know if you're asking because of the significance of bearberry in relation to the mycorrhizal association that we were just mentioning. It could be that bearberry is the one plant in the Montane zone that hangs on to the mycorrhiza that trees need to grow, and so could be a really good plant to plant before your tree species go in. That's another experiment and question to answer, and we'd love to hear more about that, but I'm afraid we haven't as yet propagated bearberry, no.
Brenda has asked, which additional trees can be propagated from root cuttings, and can any be propagated by stem cuttings or air or ground layering? And if so, how?
Okay, the vast majority of our propagation is all from seed. So the trees that we've grown from cuttings is probably limited to, well, to willows, of course, and then juniper, as I've already mentioned, and holly too, although we've just gone over to seed as much as possible on those species. There's nothing else we've grown from root cuttings except for aspen, and air layering we're not really using that, so no, I'm not I couldn't say which ones that would be successful on, I'm afraid. We're very much focused on seed. We feel that that's the ideal where possible, and then we only go for cuttings when a seed isn't possible, really.
Okay, thanks, Jill. We've had a great question from Kerry here. She's asked, where you find established Montaigne willow growing, do you find increased numbers of other plant species in the same locations?
Yes, quite often, but not always. So I think you saw a variety of the photos earlier of the willows. So those ones that are really inaccessible, there's also often some lovely plants growing with them. There was roseroot in one of those photos flowering, and yeah, a whole host of other species growing there. and then in the one we saw where it was overgrazed and eaten back and in a terrible looking state. So there'd be very little other exciting vegetation with those ones. So yeah, based on inaccessibility, there can be a community of plants with the willows as well.
Yeah, our ecologist James often goes looking for rare and interesting species in gorges, doesn't he? Places where the deer can't get to, basically.
Yeah, that's what you need. Yeah.
Right, what next? Does air pruning through root trainers, as shown in one of your slides, have any noticeable impact on the plant's taproot in the future? Or does it affect the way that the tree grows? Does it have any? Do you see any difference between the kind of success and how the trees will thrive, whether they're grown wild or whether they've come from the nursery? That was another question that was kind of similar.
So firstly, on the root trainer question, I think that yeah, we haven't dug up loads of trees to look at the roots after. That's the main problem, but it's a good question. And the main thing that the root trainer will do is produce a more fibrous root system. But I imagine that once it gets put into the ground, that just helps the tree, and it will still then produce its taproot if that's what it's planning to do. But fibrous root system will only help it from then on. And the second question about the difference between trees that are planted and trees from the wild, there certainly is a difference, but I'm not sure I can answer that in terms of the roots, because yeah, I don't research on roots, so I don't know. But certainly with birches, so particularly downy birch is the species we plant a lot of, it can be so much more successful from wild regeneration than from planting. And yeah, so the big question is why that is, and lots of people have theories, but yeah, I don't know what the answer to that is, I'm afraid. Yeah, no, I don't think I can relate that to roots, I don't think.
No worries, thanks for that. Kirsten has asked, would the Dundreggan Nursery accept tree seeds handed in by people who collected them out on hikes in the Highlands if people were to drop them off at the nursery?
No, I'm afraid we're not really after that. As I mentioned, all the seed collections are highly documented, and we have to start that process before the seed collection goes ahead. And we also are wanting to sort of ensure best practice. So as it was brought up by some of the questions and things, making sure that we've got a good mix of genetics from a population of trees and so on. So I would say that it was only very, very exceptional circumstances. Yeah, so really we're not wanting to be handed in seeds, no.
Thanks for that. And a really interesting question from David. He's asked, do any of the willow species hybridize if grown adjacent to each other?
Yes, they do. Willows are notorious for hybridizing. This causes huge problem with identifying them quite often, and is one of the questions currently being discussed by people interested in growing Montaigne willows. So one of the things we're currently coming up with talking about is how far apart these seed stands that we're producing need to be to ensure that there isn't hybridization between the stands, because we actually want to keep them apart, especially if we've collected them from different geographical areas. So some of the species don't hybridize readily, perhaps because they flower at a different time, which prevents the cross-pollination, but other species are notoriously hybridized between one another. And this is another topic that's quite hotly debated as to whether hybrids should ever be planted out or not. And the conclusion is currently that it doesn't harm to plant hybrids out, but also it's not particularly worthwhile. So in all of the work that we're doing, we're trying to produce true species and to avoid that hybridization.
Thanks, Jill. That's really interesting. Okay, I think we're nearly out of time, so we'll just go for a couple more. Kerry asked this question quite early on. What temperature do you store the seeds at?
So we store the seeds in the fridge, but I think the one thing that we may be learning is that the dryness of the seeds for longer term storage than just over winter is more important than the temperature. So if you put seeds that are too wet into the fridge, their humidity, the dampness that's in them only increases, and so it's better to keep seeds warmer and drier than cooler and damper. But if you can dry them down and seal them so that they don't re-wet once you put them in the fridge, then that's what we're doing, keeping them at fridge temperature, sealed up in their dry storage conditions.
Thank you. I'm going to combine two here. So there's been a couple of questions about packaging. Andy asked what we package the plug grown trees in for transportation to a planting site. And Joan has asked, are the containers made of plastic? And if so, do you have strategies for minimizing plastic waste?
Yeah, that's something we've been looking at quite a bit. So the plug trees are either wrapped in plastic or they go into a plastic bag to be taken out to the planting site, and then those bags are put in trays as well, which inevitably are plastic too. So what we've moved to is a wrap that is biodegradable. Well, it's certainly claimed to be biodegradable. We're currently trying to test that ourselves to see if it biodegrades, but that's what we're buying, is a biodegradable wrap now to wrap the trees in. Sometimes we put them in the bags instead, and if that's for our own site, then we can recycle or reuse rather the bags that come back from the planting site. So we absolutely do try to reuse and not create masses of plastic waste, but certainly there is plastic waste involved in the nursery, yes, and we're always looking at ways to reduce that.
Andy would like to know, what's the biodegradable wrap called, please?
I can't tell you that either off the top of my head, but I can certainly find out the name of the supplier, and maybe Kat, you can put that in the references as well.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, Jill. Okay, very last one, and I'm really sorry to everybody that we didn't get round to, but you've gotten through most of them, Jill. Brenda has asked, why do you put the trees in polytunnels? Does it speed up the germination process, or does it make the new growth soft?
It really enhances the growth just at the vulnerable stage, when just during and after germination, and that makes a huge difference to the growth. So even for those that grow quite fast and come out of the polytunnel quite soon, Yes, they are soft while they're in the polytunnel, but it's speeding up the process and yeah, just producing a higher success rate of the plants. And we have tried it in containers without using the polytunnels, and it's not so successful. And the trees often require 2 seasons of growing and 2 seasons of looking after them, and keeping them in a small plug of compost is not as good as getting them up to size in 1 season. So the tunnels do make a huge difference, although certainly you could grow them without, but yeah, for the operation that we're working on, the tunnels are a real necessity, really.
Great, thank you, Jill. We're past 9:15 now, so I think we'll let you get back to your evening, but thank you so much for a wonderful presentation and for answering all those questions. You got through over 60 questions there, so that's absolutely brilliant.
Wow.
There's a lot of really grateful comments, lots of thank yous coming through in the chat as well.
Excellent.
Yeah, huge thank you, Jill, much appreciated.
Okay.
So anyone who's got a couple of minutes, it would be great if you could let me know in the chat what other kinds of webinars you're interested in seeing from us. What other kind of topics would you like to know about? Because we are doing around 1 webinar a month. So yeah, lots of new topics coming up. So keep an eye on Facebook. Hopefully on our website soon, we'll be advertising them as well, and on Eventbrite as well, if you're interested in the future ones. And generally, they'll all be put onto our YouTube channel as well. So I will find a link and put it in the chat for you. Thanks everyone for coming.